Does training matter? Does it? What's up, everybody? Dr. Ray here, otherwise known as Ramey. And today what I'm talking about is, does training matter? What's the ROI? How do we determine it? Super important information that as someone interested in instructional design or in instructional design, you should know. You should have some stats. You should be able to roll this stuff off the tip of your tongue in 1 second when asked to justify what you do. These are the type of information I'm going to talk about is the stuff that you should have on your resume when applying to jobs so that you can actually show that what you did was effective. This is important stuff for instructional designers, which is why I'm going to go through it. So the first thing I want to do, start out this video with, is I want to talk about the ROI of training in general. Like, does training matter? I want to go through some stats. I've got a bunch of different stats here. I just want to kind of throw up on the screen as I read through them so that you kind of have them. Now, I will say, so the first thing I want to I want to say a note here is that as I put these stats up, know that these are all resources that I've been able to find the source material. So everything I'm showing you, I've read the source material and been able to find, like, how did they calculate this? Were there, like, did they have a certain amount of people, was there a methodology here? I'm not just pulling random stats off the internet or ChatGPT. If you go to Google search, like, does training matter? You do find lots of stats that when you go try to search the original source, they don't either exist or it was kind of skewed a little bit or not said correctly, and there are some problems with it. So everything I'm showing you, I've been able to find the source material. Just kind of wanted to put that out there. All right, first thing. And some of these are old. Like, some of these stats that I'm showing you are actually 20 years old, and some are much newer. But that's okay. I'm just trying to pull up some stats to show different reports that we found that show training effectiveness. I'm pulling these from corporate organizations. So we're showing corporate training effectiveness. Why is it important companies have training? All right. So the first one, Deloitte 2010, showed that companies who invest in training are 17% more profitable than their peers. Their engagement and retention rates of employees are 30 to 50% higher. Huge numbers. Why is engagement and retention of employees important? Because it costs a lot of money to let go of someone and have to bring on a new person. You know, you're not a full employee for 6 months or a year. You're like learning on your job. So learning, they have to train you. So being able to show that we've retained employees, super important. A Gallup article from 2019, the organizations that have invested in training and development, 11% greater profitability. So we had Deloitte said 17, a 2019 report said 11% greater profitability. Twice as likely to retain their employees. Twice as likely. That's a big deal, because they also, in that report, said that cost of replacing an employee is often 1.5 to 2 times their annual salary. This is why retention and recruitment are so important. Why, as a trainer, e-learning, learning and development specialist, we should kind of be able to say, like, oh yeah, you know, the Gallup, 11% more likely to greater profitability, twice as likely to stay. All right, a report by IBM in 2013, older but still a report. Trained employees often meet their objectives 3 times more often. Customer satisfaction, 16% greater. 22% faster rollouts, 35% less time searching for content. New employees, 3 times more likely to stay. So we had a 2019 that says twice. IBM report says 3 times as likely to stay. So what this starts, you start to see these trends in these different reports that, hey, most likely, if they're all finding, hey, it's 2 to 3 times more likely to stay, people are more likely to stay. There's some percentage there that trained employees are more likely to stay, which can save us money. So we're trying to make the case for having training teams, right? Glassdoor 2024, improved new hire retention by 82%. Society for Human Resource Management 2024, employees who undergo structured onboarding training programs are 69% more likely to stay with the company for 3 years. Accenture, this is an old one. This is the oldest one I have. Accenture 2006, For every dollar invested in training, companies received $4.53 in return, a 353% ROI. Now I'm going to get into ROI in just a minute here when I go through these stats. While that's an old statistic, that's a huge return. For every dollar invested in training, companies received a 353% ROI in that dollar. That's a huge statistic. Now, I saw that specific report cited over and over and over again on the internet when I did the research for this video in articles from 2025, making it sound like the statistic was from 2025. It took me a lot of digging actually to find the original book where that came from 2006. So this is where you got to pay attention to the sources that you're using. Even though it's 19 years old, I think it's a pretty significant finding. And it's from a respected company, Accenture. So, and then I just want to pull this up on the screen from a 2020 McKinsey and Company survey, McKinsey, the big consulting firm survey. They did a survey of executives at various companies. They actually had 1,216 executives report in this survey, and they were asking them what they expect future. They were talking about future of the workforce, all that kind of stuff. They found that 43% are currently experiencing skill gaps of their employees. 22% expected more gaps in the next 2 years, the next 3 to 5, another 22%. So that's when skill gaps, 43% were experiencing skill gaps in their current organization. And then share of organizations' current roles at risk of being disrupted by market or technology trends. Little do they know COVID was coming right before they did this. But you can see the numbers here. Pretty interesting to look at that, all those numbers that I just showed, and start to see like value of training. I think the biggest things overall of value of training is that employee retention and engagement is increased, which is pretty big. Big save. Now these stats are big, like saving money. But what we get into is we're doing all these instructional design projects and maybe we can't see employee engagement or retention. But so here's where ROI comes into training and where you start to think about like, what can I put on my resume to show ROI of like this e-learning that I was asked to develop for this company. How do I do that? Why is it important? It's important because it justifies your specific job. So those statistics that I just read are like what's the ROI of training in general? Like we know that there's these big overarching themes of like, yes, training is important. But what I want to do now is break it down into the small. And the small is like, start looking at like your projects and determine what the ROI is, why is that important, and how do we capture it? Because it's super important. Because when I'm looking at a resume of someone that's worked in the industry for 5, 6, 7 years, and I see no ROI on every line of their resume of what they did, besides like, management, use certain software, should be like, I did this training project, we saved 70%. We saved our company X amount of dollars. We saved 70% of time. We did that's what I should be reading on the resume. And when I don't see that, there are a few reasons why. And one could be that the employee just wasn't allowed to, whatever. But the other could be that the employee just didn't really know how to calculate ROI with their training projects. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of this video. All right, so I've talked about training in general. And now I want to get to this ROI of the small, like you do an e-learning project or a ginormous training project for a company and capturing ROI. All right, so mostly when we start talking about like determining ROI of a project, we get into this like evaluation. There's like numerous evaluation models, whether they're 4 steps or 6 steps or whatever one we use, Kirkpatrick being like the biggest one. I'll pop that one up on the screen. The main one we use, it doesn't really matter. They all come down to one thing, and that's the last step, which is return on investment. What is this actually doing? Did the problem you're trying to solve do something, and by how much? So to start out, When you're looking at ROI, you're going to determine the ROI. The first absolute most important thing you need to do is have some kind of problem, and from that problem, develop performance metrics. What are my KPIs? Determine those performance metrics, and KPI are key performance indicators. All right, so we go back to this, like these evaluation models. Let's put that up on the screen. We get to this Kirkpatrick's. We have level 1 here, which is reaction. The only thing that tells me is, did my employees like this training? It tells me nothing about meeting my objectives, unless my objective was to see if my employees liked the training. It can make you feel better if they liked it, but guess what? I don't really care if my employees hated my training if my objectives were met. And there's some kinds of training that maybe my employees aren't meant to like. All right. And I do care if they like it or not, but there's just sometimes it doesn't matter so much. All right, next step, we have learning here. Again, learning just tells me they learned the content. It doesn't tell me if my training solved the problem. It just tells me they learned something, which is great. It's nice. But again, it just tells me that my training met its learning objectives, but did not necessarily meet its business objectives. So then we get into levels 3 or 4 of Kirkpatrick's. And if you're using a different model, there might be a level 5, which says ROI. But basically level 3, level 4 of Kirkpatrick's are the return on investment. Is the training being applied on the job, and is it doing something? What's happening? And that's what we care about, that ROI. We care about those next steps, ROI. All right, we have these KPIs, key performance in. What are key performance? So when you're going to do a training project, and I say you have to have a problem, you've got to be fixing or solving something, a problem. You break that problem into your KPIs. What are we actually doing? Are we trying to increase productivity? Are we trying to train someone on a new tool? Are we trying to increase sales numbers? Are we trying to increase customer satisfaction? Are we trying to increase quality standards? You tell me what you're trying to. You might be trying to save time. You might be trying to save money. It just depends. And what those KPIs are determines on how we collect the data and how we analyze it to determine the ROI. So how do we track those numbers? They're really hard to track. The first thing I'll say is, those of you that are consultants, your job becomes way harder trying to track this stuff. I get told, no, we can't give you that kind of data all the time from clients. So it happens. They don't get mad at you for asking, so you still have to ask. But they typically, as a contractor or as a consultant, it's very difficult to get that data. But sometimes you can get it. And sometimes you have to figure out other ways to maybe collect it. But it becomes really difficult to track. But for those of you who are employees at a company, super important for you to have this, super important for you to be able to adjust your job, because at the end of the year, when a company's looking over their metrics, they want to be able to see training department cost $100 million, saved $700 million. All of a sudden, your job becomes a lot more important, which is why this is super important. All right, so how do we get those numbers? You got to have two things. You got to have two numbers to compare. That's it. That's how you got to have a before and after, or we've got to have a control and a group going through the experiment. So that's it. We've got to have a before, we've got to have an after, we got to have a control, and we got to have a group going through. One of those two. And that control and group going through could be like an industry benchmark. Like, hey, just as an example, you take the military. So before and after examples are like, hey, sales were 22%, now they're 32%. So sales went up. Hey, customer satisfaction was 3%, now it's 9%. Hey, calls to the call center, 7% of our employees were calling at the call center, now only 2% are. So there are less calls at the call center. Our call center people can actually do what they're supposed to be. Our IT group can do what they're doing. Those before and after. Sometimes you need that control versus not control, or a benchmark, like some kind of standard, something like that. Just as an example of that, doing a project for the military, they were developing simulations for flying, like a flight pattern, training pilots. Developing the simulation costs, it was like $700,000 to develop the simulation. It sounds expensive, but what we found is each time they needed to probably run this mission, if they were doing it real, they probably would need to run it like 10 to 15 times, and it was going to cost like $3 million each time they ran the mission, because that includes like fuel and all this stuff that goes into taking these flights up in the air. And so we realized that we could spend $700,000 developing the simulation. They could run it 100 times, costing like nothing each time after the initial investment. And then they only needed to do the real thing like 2 times. So we saved like 11 trips, and each trip was $3 million. We saved $33 million, after the 700. We saved like around $30 million by developing this big training simulation. So you've got to have those numbers, the before or the control, and what it's going to turn out to. Before and after, you got to get the two numbers. So that's your trick when you're trying to figure out those KPIs. What is happening? What is the current metric that I'm using? And how am I going to find the end metric? How do you get those numbers? It could be feedback, surveys, something from managers. It could be that your company just does a really good job of tracking what's happening, and you're able to just get that. You might have to pull out industry standard benchmarks from other places. Really, just there's 100 different things that could be your metric. So you have to figure out, how do I get this specific metric? Once you do that, you determine how much money you're saving. So that's the overall. Does training matter? And that breaks it down to the little, what do I need to determine ROI, and why is it important that I do it? Just remember, you gotta justify yourself. You gotta justify us as trainers and instructional designers. Justify training to companies, and we have to be able to do this. And a lot of companies do a really good job of this. I'm not saying that, I never wanted to make the impression that this doesn't happen. I just want to help reiterate that, and just wanted to help reiterate it and make sure that it is happening, because it's super, uber important, y'all. Later.